the literary device paradox. So a paradox is essentially like a contradictory statement. That like when you first hear it, you're gonna be like, okay, so well that's not possible because it's again a contradictory statement. So in the Tempest, I feel like personally I think that paradoxes are probably best used in literature if you want to either make it something that the audience will remember. Because if like someone is reading or listening to your story and they hear like a paradox, they're probably going to want to think more about it because they're not going to be entirely sure like why it's happening or what it means. So I think it's another way to increase the memorability of that line. Another thing I believe paradoxes can be used for is to make someone think more deeply about a character or to develop a character in itself. So in The Tempest, I found a quote saying that Caliban says, and it says, "Bygone Caliban has a new master, get me man, freedom, high day." And it's in Act 2, Scene 2, line 190 to 192. And I found that really interesting because in that line, he's essentially saying that he has a new master. Like he's still a slave and everything, but he's saying his ability to choose his master is giving him freedom. So he thinks he's a free person. So that line is a paradox because it makes the reader think about, well, how can you be a slave and still be like free? Because those two are contradictory statements. So I feel like that'll make the reader think more about Caliban and like what he perceives freedom to be. Yeah.
I also think that's true, like how he thinks he will be free, but he's not, since Prospero still kind of like controlling him in that aspect. And I really like the quote you picked out because it shows how he thinks that way. And yeah.
Well, I agree. I think that paradoxes, they intensify the story, and they really make the readers think deeply to understand the story, and it keeps them engaged.
Likewise, I agree because, paradoxes keep the reader invested. They give them something to think about instead of like just straight up telling him, "Hey, he's a slave." They like kind of state it, and it's up for like interpretation. Even though we know he's a slave, characters in the story that met him but not like his master could still think that he's a free person because of the way he thinks. So the paradox gives something to think about, and it helps create a more believable environment for the characters.
Okay, yeah, so I agree with like all of you, like what you said. I think paradoxes are really important because, again, character development is one of the key things that hooks a person to a story. Like if you read a story and you don't like any of the characters, you're probably going to end up not enjoying the story. But if you understand the characters, and paradoxes will help you do that because you'll think more about, okay, so like for example in this, when I read the line, I was thinking, okay, so Caliban's perception of freedom is different than other people because maybe he's been in slavery for too long, or maybe Prospero was such like a bad person to him, he believed the ability to just choose a master is going to make him free, you know? So I feel like you can learn more about a character through what they say. And paradoxes, again, like you guys said, it intensifies the story and it makes it deeper, is what I think. So yeah.
Okay, do you want me to go?
Yeah.
Okay, so my literary device is tone, which is how the author wants to make the reader feel. So in The Tempest, I was able to find three main underlying tones. In the first few acts, the first act mainly, there's a frantic tone, as we see like the seamen and the mariners and all like the sailors and stuff. They all have like they're all like in the Tempest. They're like, oh crap, what's gonna happen? And they're like praying. Like for instance, this quote that I just had pulled up is a boatswain saying, "I pray now, keep below," which shows the danger of the tempest. And then once more mariners come on, you see them yelling at each other, creating a frantic like sense. And when you read this or see it in a play, it makes you feel frantic. It like is what Shakespeare wants you to feel. And then it goes to a more mystical, calm-ish tone. Like for instance, in scene 2, it's on like an island. It's more like calm, and there's a lot more like calmer dialogue and like thinking in scene 2. And there's also mystical creatures. Like we're introduced to like Ariel and other characters like what's his name? the native of the island that Caliban meets. Tranquilla. We find characters like that seem to be like mystical, inhuman, but they're really just as human as any other character. And then after that tone passes over in the last few acts, so you can feel a more like cheery, humorous tone as it ends in a happy ending, and there's like a wedding, which is a staple in every comedy play of Shakespeare, and there's more like comedic scenarios, such as like the trap that Prospero sets for the people, and also like no one dies, which is like a once in a Shakespearean play, which helps paint the happy tone, and yeah,
Right, so you know what? I actually agree with you on that. I believe, especially the frantic tone in the beginning, it like really helps kick off the story, because not only does it another thing I believe actually made the tone was like the frantic word choice that they used, more than like the plot also contributes to it, but the word choice, like for example, in the first quote you used was I pray thee keep below, right? And it has like an exclamation mark, and it's like I pray thee, so like he's like begging the other people to like run for cover, so it like does make it like seem frantic. The reason I believe like the second act and like the acts in like the middle tend to be like more mystical, or tend to give the reader more of like whimsical rather like view of it, because it's like developing the world, like the universe that it's like set in, so you need to add more, you know, magic, and you need to add more like places and characters, because you want the reader to actually understand what's going on, or like what world they've transported into. So I believe that's another thing. I like how he went from frantic at the beginning and it like seamlessly like switched to like a lighthearted view at the end. Because from the beginning, especially how we started it off with like a shipwreck, you would think that the ending would not be that great either. Like you think it would like continue to be that like tone, because most stories like that have a scary tone or whatever throughout. So I feel like, yeah, that's really interesting, and how it ends in a nice tone is cool too.
Yeah, and I agree with that the switch between the different tones keeps the readers engaged into the story, and it, like, the story as a whole attracts the audience, and at the end it made everyone happy. So it made a good story.
I agree with the tone words that you chose for the 3 different parts of the story, because like not one story has one tone. It like shifts tone throughout, and I agree with the frantic one at the beginning, because you know they're kind of just thrown into this big storm and they don't know what they're going to do, and eventually they shipwreck. And I agree with what you said, the mystical tone kind of like develops the story for the audience to get to know the world a little bit, and then the end is like comedic, so because obviously it's a Shakespeare comedy and it's not like tragic ending.
Yeah, well, the shift in tone helps to like create the story, as the beginning tone of frantic, it like hooks the viewer / reader in. They're like, oh gosh, what's gonna happen? And then the more mystical tone engages them and keeps them invested as it introduces characters and like the plot, and also magic. And then at the end, the happy ending keeps readers or viewers with like a feel good emotion. Like instead of like leaving Romeo and Juliet, you're not going to be crying. You're going to be like, ha, that was pretty funny. Yeah.
Romeo and Juliet.
No, in the Tempest. Oh gosh, that made so much sense.
Okay, well, now we're gonna talk about figurative language, and hyperbole is an exaggerated statement that can be used for emphasis. And one example is, "Your tale, sir, would cure deafness," and it was said by Miranda when Prospero was explaining to her that about the story of their history, and Miranda was emphasizing that she was clearly listening by saying that it would cure deafness. And next is personification. It's when the author gives human characteristics to non-human objects, and they're used to connect the personified object to the reader's emotions. One example is, "This music crept by me upon the waters, allaying both their fury and my passion with its sweet air." And It was said by Ferdinand when he was grieving about his father by the ocean, and suddenly Ariel started playing music which calmed his fury. Another example is the winds did sing it to me, and the thunder, that deep and dreadful organ pipe pronounced the name Prosper. And this is basically comparing the winds to Ariel when she was explaining to Alonso about the bad things that he had done to Prospero, and it showed the regret and guilt that he had. Next is alliteration, and they are basically repeated consonants used by writers for emphasis and to create the mood of the story. One example is, "Hast thou forgot the fowl which Sycorax, who with age and envy was grown into milk?" I think the F in "forgot the fowl" emphasizes how foul the witch was, and it also it was oh yeah, and Prospero reminded her that, like, when Ariel was asking Prospero about her freedom, Prospero got angry and reminded her that he was the one who freed her in the first place. So it shows how powerful and strict that he could be, and it creates an intimidating mood. Another example is "full fathom 5 thy father lies," and they're used, well, that was said by Ariel, I think, and she said this to emphasize to Ferdinand that Alonso is dead in the sea and to create a gloomy environment. The last figurative language is onomatopoeia, and it is a sound that mimics a word used to add humor and to be expressive. One example is ding dong, and it was what the spirits sang to mimic the death bells of Ferdinand's father, so it emphasizes that too. Another example is hark, hark, and it is basically a command to listen or to hear.
I like the examples that you pulled out of the figurative language, and I feel like it also helps him describe the scene and what's going on, since like there weren't many props, if I remember right, many props used in the plays, and so he had to find another way for the audience to understand kind of the pictures that or like the actions that he wanted them to see. So by like including the hyperboles, alliterations, and all those different figurative language, I feel like the audience was more like in the moment. Also, not just the actors on the stage just saying these bunch of random words that's boring. So I feel like that's what really pulls the audience in to pay attention and enjoy all of his plays.
Yeah. I agree with that. The figurative language brings like people to like understand and like be there instead of just like watching a bunch of people get up on stage and read a bunch of scripts. It helps create like a more like more story driven, more like an actual play. Like without figurative languages, like it would just be boring. Yeah.
Okay, so I feel like I agree with all of you. First, I want to say that, and then I want to say that for all the figurative language, like I'm looking at all of them, and in my perspective, I feel like the things that like each one does like has a different function. Like writers will use them all for different things. I feel like onomatopoeia, in my perspective, seems like something that would be really important in like a play, especially when you're like in a play with like not many props and not many actors and people are switching out all the time. I feel like onomatopoeia would be very important because you don't want to have to say like, for example, in the quote that she used, like ding dong, you don't want to say like the bell is ringing because you want to make sure the audience can like like they're involved. You want them to be invested because of the props. Like in most plays nowadays, like the props will keep them in, or like the huge amount of like characters will keep them in, but they can't do that here. So I feel like allowing onomatopoeias, like it'll make like the audience have to like think about it. Like they'll be more involved in the story. So like, because if someone like was in a play, like in a movie, and instead of an actual bell like ringing, they say like the bell is ringing, like you're not going to be as invested in the story. So I feel like onomatopoeia is important in like hooking the reader in. Personification also seems like important because it helps you like, it gives you more of like an understanding of what's going on in the story. Like you can understand more of like what the vibe is, like how the tone is, what the mood is. You can understand all that by writers using personification. See, I think figurative language is like a super important part of the Tempest, especially with like the roots of the play, like what it was originally written for and stuff like that. I feel like figurative language would be one of the most important literary devices that this play could have.
Without figurative language, the story would be really boring because it adds humor and it engages the audience.
So for symbolism, I feel like the Tempest, the title, or like the storm, means the storm, is an important symbol because it symbolizes kind of the storm of his emotions, kind of. And in Act 1, Scene 2, line 230, Prospero says to Ariel, "Hast thou spirit performed to point the tempest that I bade thee?" So he's kind of also like, the Tempest also shows that he can control and his, not control, but like point his storm of emotion in a certain direction. Like when he knew his brother Antonio and his friend Alonso was coming past the island, so he wanted his storm of emotion to point in their direction because he's like harvested all this anger that he's gotten from them making him abandon him on an island. So he's kind of harvested that anger and he wants to show them what he felt like when they did that to him. And also I feel like water is a symbolism of like death or badness, because when they were talking about water, when Alonso kind of like gives up hope that Ferdinand was dead because they were separated after the shipwreck and they didn't know where each other was. So he says that he is drowned, whom thus we stray to find, and the sea mocks, in Act 3, Scene 3, line 10. And I just feel like it symbolizes how they associate water with death and kind of badness, but they didn't actually know Ferdinand was dead. And Ferdinand, I believe, also says something with water. I can't find it. Yeah.
Okay, right. So I completely agree with you that the Tempest is a very strong symbolism, not only because of the title of the play, but also because it kind of symbolizes how the plot goes. So I remember, again, like you said in the beginning of the story, it starts out with a storm, like a tempest, meaning like storm. Tempestuous noise, there's all that, the word choice and like the actual plot, like what's going on. And then I feel like that all, like, it kind of symbolizes his emotions, like you said. Like if his emotions are like warring with each other, like like stormy emotions, like that saying, I feel like that also goes with how the Tempest works. Like because at the beginning he's all over the place, he's resentful, he's angry about stuff, he's like all over the place. And at the end of the story, he wants like the storm to stop and everything. And then everything's peaceful and calm, he's happy and content, and then happily ever after is how the story goes. So I feel like, especially with not only the plot, but also like just the symbolism of the story, like for people to understand the story like a deeper level, I feel like the Tempest would probably be one of the best examples of symbolism in the story. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's like the storm is what like is Prospero, but then the rebuilding after the storm is what the story is. Like it's Prospero realizing his mistakes, learning his mistakes, and then Tempest, like the calm after the storm, like after a storm's done and like everything's destroyed, you have to rebuild it. Like, and that's what the story is about. It's like Prospero gathering himself and like rebuilding, fixing, and establishing like help for himself and like creating or recreating himself, kind of.
I think symbolism also intensifies the story like a paradox because it makes us think about the connection between the symbols, and it also keeps the audience engaged in the story.
And I also just remember, like, at the end, he tells the Tempest to go away or, like, fade away. And by the end of the story, he kind of, like, gathered his emotions already. And, like, he's reconciled with his brother, and his dukedom is restored, but also the other characters are brought together. And so they're really happy, and so his storm of emotions, he kind of sends it away and tells his spirit Ariel to, you know, calm the storm down and to end his emotions and the damage it's